What is your worst experience with bad neighbors? Their dogs got into my backyard and attacked my dog. My dog ended up okay, but it was a long recovery and he still doesn't walk right. He wasn't the happiest dog ever, so to see him on the ground covered in blood was the worst thing ever. The dogs were able to get through because their kids had taken a plank out of my fence. They didn't have a fence. I left a letter on their door explaining the situation. They showed up at my door to tell me that it was my fault for not having a stronger fence and that they wouldn't be paying any medical bills. After a lot of them yelling and me calmly explaining why they actually would be paying, they eventually complied. They did build a fence, backwards, with the flat side facing them. They are also loud as frick. Got chickens that escape on a regular basis in our suburban neighborhood and are overall scummy people. Lived in a small apartment and my neighbors always cranked up their music to 11. Like loud, and until something like 7 AM. Maybe later, but that's when I would leave for work. It was so loud that I couldn't hear my own TV over it. My neighbors and I would bang on the door but they would never open the door. It was like trying to sleep at a festival. Then at some point I found out they often left for a bar across the street but would just leave the music on. So I would pull the breaker for their apartment, but they would just come back at 5 AM and turn it back on. It was reported by heaps of people, but nothing was ever done. So at some point I would jam their lock when they went out so their keys wouldn't work anymore and they had to get the property manager in while the music was blasting inside. After a couple of times of that happening they were evicted. Maybe I'm the bad neighbor in this story. You did the rest of your neighbors a good deed. When I started my first job post-college, I was thrilled to live by myself for the first time in my life. I had this beautiful one-bedroom apartment in a solid part of town. Everything was great until 6 months later, when new tenants moved in next to my unit. I had a package go missing, a phone case. Amazon had posted a photo of it at my door, so I thought that it was just a fluke. Then it happened again, and again, and again. The office wouldn't accept packages, so I had to get my items delivered to friends' places instead. Overall wildly inconvenient and the police didn't care in the slightest when I reported it, so I just figured I'd deal with it. Fast forward a few weeks, and I come home after being gone for less than an hour, to see that my doorknob and front door were scrapped up and the knob was barely hanging on. Long story short, I had been parking in plain view of this guy's window, so he was able to tell when I was home. I am 100% convinced he tried to break into my place, and that me coming home early interrupted him. I googled his name after I moved. I got it off a package at his door, and found that he was a convicted felon with charges that include grand theft auto, domestic assault, drug dealing, and an attempted break-in. Lived on the bottom floor of a 2-story Victorian. There was very little sound insulation between the 2 floors. When we moved in there was a friendly older couple that had a dog. We could hear it running around but honestly no big deal. Then they moved out and these 3 young guys moved in. Seemed nice at first but they turned out to be horrible. Officially the rental agreement said quiet hours started at like 9 PM. We basically told them, look, we're usually out of the house a lot and not home until late. As long as you're quiet by midnight during the week and 2 AM, bar time, on weekends they're cool. This seemed incredibly reasonable to me. Within a couple weeks of them moving in it was non-stop crappy techno music being blasted at all hours. As we had said, we weren't home much so that didn't bother us all that much. What did was the Tuesday night parties going until 4 AM. I'd go to their front door to ask them to quiet down and it would take a few minutes of ringing the doorbell and pounding before anyone would come down. Usually eyes were glazed over from either booze or drugs. I complained to their landlord multiple times but nothing really fixed it. I finally just started calling the cops and that would get them to stop for that night at least. The final straw was they had a party with easily 60 or 70 people. Again, not a big deal, until it was 3 AM and the club music was blasting and everyone decided jumping up and down would be a great idea. I actually could see the ceiling flexing. I finally sat down and wrote a cease and desist letter detailing the city's noise ordinances and various other legal crap that would give me cause to sue them and put it in their mailbox. Sent it to their landlord as well. That stopped things. Should have done it months before that. Finally the landlord had enough I guess because he came in and raised their rent to something insane like $6,000 a month. We live in an expensive city, but that was like 2x market rate at least. There was no rent control for this building, so they were out within the month. Was pretty glorious to hear them yelling at each other about finding a new place to live. Definitely the shithead 19-year-olds that lived next door to me when I was finishing up college that screamed at Call of Duty at the top of their lungs through paper-thin walls every night when they got killed. Who also threw a pumpkin on the roof of my car, causing $3K worth of damage, which is considered felony vandalism in Michigan. I finally got them to confess and basically gave him a stern talking to as a 22-year-old that was just done with college nonsense at that point, and told him I wasn't going to press charges as long as his insurance paid for it. Later that year, when his roommate was flipping out about COD and yelled something along the lines of "Goddammit freaking hackers, everyone is freaking cheating. What the frick is this bulls? I hate this game. Bunch of freaking losers and cheaters," which was very clear through my bedroom wall while I was studying. So I didn't hesitate, since it had been months of that, after he got done with his tantrum and said, "That sounds like you just suck at COD. Bro." I heard a crash of what sounded like a controller being banished to the shadow realm, and then didn't hear anything from him for a month. It was glorious. I'm absolutely amazing. Get good. Apartment building. The upstairs neighbor's dog peed on their patio and it dripped down onto me while I was sitting outside reading. I yelled and ran to shower, and when I texted them to ask them to take their dog out to pee in future, they said it wasn't their dog and it must have blown over from somewhere else. What? Bro, that is next level. I have a few from the same neighbor who I'll call Linda. Linda would often have men outside the apartment building that she locked out screaming her name. But the best story regards a boyfriend Linda had who insisted my roommate and I call him the captain. About a week after meeting him, we came home to a wedding announcements for Linda and the captain. Yes, his name was the captain on the announcement. Exactly 1 week later still, the captain was arrested outside our apartment building for public intoxication at 2 AM while screaming, "I've made a huge mistake. Frick you, Linda. A huge mistake. I'm ruined." Okay, but there's potentially an amazing backstory here that went missing and it's gonna drive me nuts. I used to live in a horrible apartment with paper-thin walls. The people next door were a woman who looked like she was in her 70s and what I thought was her 30-something grandson. They would yell at each other all day, constantly blast their TV, and the smell of their cigarette smoke would waft through into my apartment and make the place absolutely reek. The worst was at night when the two of them would have loud sex, which is how I figured out they weren't related. Every night for an hour, creaking bed banging against my bedroom wall and the old woman moaning like a stuck pig. Nightmarish. I also think the guy kept track of my schedule and watched for me, because whenever I came home or went out, even when I took out the garbage, he would be there outside his place, trying to chit chat with me while staring at my body and being completely gross. Lived there a year, but it felt like 10. They could still be related. We had some neighbors that used to leave their garbage out in plastic bags the night before garbage day, instead of putting it in a bin. Around here, that's just ringing the dinner bell for raccoons and other critters. Sure enough, come morning there's garbage strewn all over the neighborhood. What the raccoons and skunks didn't spread around, the wind picked up the slack. Some of the people on the street kindly approached the guy and asked him to put his garbage in a bin. He told them to go frick themselves. Thus began the garbage wars. Every morning of garbage day, some people on my street would collect all the half-eaten and rotten trash from their lawns and toss it back into the dude's backyard. He would collect it, then dump it back on their lawns, or cram it into their bushes. People started finding half-eaten burritos and candy wrappers in their mailboxes. The street started to look like a slum. Police were called, health inspectors, city by law enforcement. Each side was calling in whatever authority they could muster to get their enemy in crap. The dude and his family. Amazingly, his wife seemed perfectly pleasant. Lasted about 8 months, then moved. Every once in a while I find a random margarine lid or piece of styrofoam in my hedge, and my mind goes back to those dark days of war. Thank you for your service. I lived in an apartment with slot of rotating tenants. An elderly lady moved in across the hall from me, promptly started hoarding. I started to figure it out when her deck porch started to fill up with odds and ends furniture, including but not limited to a roll-top desk. She also yelled at me once for taking her key out of the front door and putting it in the mail slot. Anyway, after a couple of weeks I started to realize I hadn't seen her in a while and started to smell something real weird. Turns out she had died and no one knew about it for a week, hence the smell. Her family came and cleared out all her stuff about a week after that. This is Wisconsin in the winter and I had my good Doc Marten work boots outside my door because they were wet. They used one of my boots to prop open their door while they moved out and then stole them when they were done. Not the Doc Martens. Oh. I rented a flat with an ex and the upstairs neighbor was an absolute nightmare. Deadbeat dad who had his kid every weekend and left them screaming all the time. He'd blast music until sunrise every day even when he had his kid. Got the council involved, nothing happened. Got child services involved, nothing happened. He used to argue every Sunday with his ex about how he wasn't paying child support. They'd argue right outside our door. We were on the ground floor. The guy was unemployed, owed the landlord a lot of money, and only left his flat to get groceries or drugs. He kicked off at me because my cat meowed loudly once. Honey, I told you I will get the fricking money by next month. 11 exclamation point 11111 exclamation point 1111. Hey man, get that cat under control, I can barely hear my thoughts. My current neighbors will randomly light bombshell fireworks in the middle of the night during the middle of the week as if some of us don't have to wake up early for work. Also, when I was younger and living in a different city, our front neighbors stole our dog from our backyard one day and we didn't find out it was them until a few months later when we saw our dog in their yard. They denied they stole it and wouldn't give it back to us until we got the police involved. I'm so glad you got your dog back. They were crackheads. They had 2 kids, were physically and verbally abusive to each other and were hoarders on top of it. Tried calling Child Protective Services and the police over and over and was never taken seriously. They ended up burning down their apartment and caused thousands of dollars in damage to the rest of the apartment building because they were cooking M. We had to move out, as did many others. The silver lining is that they finally got their kids taken away after that. I used to live in a house that was split into 2 apartments. My neighbors had the lower half, and I learned we had issues with the HVAC when their cigarette smoke came visibly pouring out our registers, stank up everything we owned. Then one of them stole my car. Dude pretended to be a reverend but was actually just a filthy freaking hoarder. He insisted on wearing sandals all of the time, and whenever he left his flat, the entire stairwell would stink of century-old and washed feet. Eventually, the beetles that had infested his flat crawled up and into our kitchen and then everywhere. Took months to get him evicted. Frick that guy. Moved into a crappy apartment in a building that was occupied by basically the worst people in the area. Pretty rural small town. Junkies, alcoholics, etc. I moved there because I don't have a driver's license and I needed to live close to my new job at a cafe. No buses in the area, except school buses, and it was relatively cheap. Anyways, one night when I came home from work, I met 2 of my neighbors by the entrance to the building. These 2 were living wall to wall with me, and I had listened to their drugged up Saturnalia more than once. They started following me up the stairs, not saying a single word, just following me. I rush inside and lock the door, when they start hammering at it, yelling, hammering their hands at the door so hard I thought they would break it. I yelled back at them, what the frick do you want? Leave me alone. They stopped their hammering and the man said, with a fragile voice, we were just wondering if we could borrow your pee for a drug test tomorrow. I not so politely declined, told them to frick off, and called the police. Didn't live there for much longer, I'll tell you that. Had one that would basically steal our mail and other stuff from our porch and yard. Caught her once to confront her and she started yelling at me to stop attacking her and tried to say I was stealing her stuff. Ended up with the police getting called and us filing a restraining order against her. As a postal employee, you should have called the USPS. They don't frick around. I've posted this before. Our neighbor was tossing bags of her vomit into my yard for about a year, like 50 bags. Called the cops. Turns out she had an eating disorder she was hiding from her parents. My neighbor once shot both my dogs and his goat and made me bury both. One dog survived thankfully. He then tried to make us pay for a new goat claiming that our dogs attacked it. The goat had bullet wounds and no bite marks. The dude's a psychopath. Lived in an apartment building with little better than paper for walls. You could clearly hear the next door neighbors' conversations, them having sex, walking up the stairs, etc. For some reason they thought it would be totally awesome to install a surround sound system and affix the speakers to our shared wall. It was not awesome. It was so loud that it literally shook the wall, and we couldn't hear our own television unless we turned it up ridiculously loud in return. The neighbors did not respond kindly to our request that they place the speakers elsewhere, or at least turn the bass down. It ultimately ended with cops being called on them after the guy got pee at being asked again to turn it down and started pounding on the wall and screaming about how he was going to freak us up. They finally got evicted when he threatened someone at the management office on some other matter. Before he got evicted, though, we begged the office to let us move to a different apartment. Couldn't afford the lease breaking fee to just leave, and they did let us move to another building. And our new neighbors had a parrot that never shut the frick up, and a special needs child who would literally spend hours banging on their piano screaming singing "My name is Amanda." What can one do in that situation except grin and bear it, I guess. Once our lease was up, I was so freaking glad to leave that apartment complex. Some noise is expected in apartment buildings. I've certainly lived in other apartments and was fine with the normal expected amount of noise. But when there's zero sound insulation and you have neighbors that don't give a crap, it sucks. When you switched to a different apartment, it was like switching lines in the store to one that you thought was going to be shorter but you were wrong. I have a schizophrenic neighbor that has believed for years that I am hacking his electronic devices, scanning his phone, harassing, terrorizing him, etc. Over the years he has claimed I've held an old man hostage in my condo, allowed blood to drip from my patio to his, and that I'm a terrible racist. He leaves notes on the inside of his car accusing me of these things. Guy owned 6 cars and kept them all parked on the street in a very congested block of apartments. Spent hours tending to them, and they somehow always looked rustier when he was done. If a leaf landed on one of his cars, he would accuse the neighborhood of intentionally placing leaves on his car to annoy him. There's a whole list with this one. We moved into an apartment complex and the neighbors right next door on our landing made our experience there extremely uncomfortable, to put it lightly. 2 weeks after we moved in, 20 armed officers showed up and breached the neighbor's door. The cops said they couldn't locate the person they were after, and that's all the info we got on the incident. Through our shared wall, we heard a man shout, "If you don't stop doing that, I swear to God I'll punch you again. Do you want me to punch you again?" followed by a child crying. We called CPS and then we were afraid because we were the only ones that could have heard, so they'd know it was us who called. Very often, we'd see strangers at the neighbor's doorstep. When they'd knock on the neighbor's door, it was easy to hear from anywhere in our apps, and sometimes we'd think maybe it was our door. Many times, we'd hear a child next door answer, and then shout something like, "Mom, so and so is ready." I'd like to believe she was just giving haircuts or something. Technically still against lease agreement, but based on the types of people showing up at the door, it seems unlikely. We were exiting the apartment at the same time as the neighbors, and lived on the 2nd floor. Their 4-year-old fell all the way down the concrete stairs to the ground level. We were horrified and moved to help. The mother stepped in and ignored us, yelled at her crying indefinitely her child, and then quickly got in their car and drove off. We moved after a year and never looked back. But I do think about those kids and I feel sad knowing that so many children are in abusive situations, raised by incompetent parents who were likely raised in the same terrible cycle. Probably our neighbors in our apartment that just let their dang dog bark all day long on their porch. Like, I don't think that dog is ever inside even during the winter until it's nighttime. It's so annoying. A bunch of things with my ding dong neighbor. She had a large dog that hated my older, smaller dog. One day her dog ran into my yard and bit my dog. She did apologize for this one. Did not happen again. Neighbor dumped her lawn clippings into my backyard. Had to ask her to stop and clean up her mess. She decided to build a fence. No survey. So I paid for a survey of my property. She started building her fence 3 feet over on my property. I had her stop and remove the fence. She was angry and never rebuilt it. I painted my house. She painted her house. Same color. I bought a new car. She bought a new car. Same color. Same configuration. There's other minor stuff, but that's enough. Odd person. Very odd. I painted my house. She painted her house. Same color. I bought a new car. She bought a new car. Same color. Same configuration. This is like the final evolution of that kid who imitates everything you do. This family keeps on moving their stuff over to our side of the property. We confronted them, but they keep on saying it's their land because their house has a fireplace that's extruded into our yard. We had to request paperwork from the city to tell them that's not how it works. Then they just kept on throwing their dog crap over the fence and even dug a hole below the fence to let their dog over to pee and crap. We moved shortly after cause we found a bigger and better place to purchase. Sad thing is all they probably took was heck yeah, we made them move out. So they learned nothing. Not that people like that will learn anything anyways. My neighbor was allowing their large dog to crap in my backyard. This happened day after day. I placed a shovel out by my fire pit, and when my neighbor was in his yard, I took the shovel and re-gifted it back to their yard. They got the message. Found out they had an elderly cat who couldn't chew properly, and that they kept her outside and gave her dry food despite her inability to chew it. Poor creature showed up in our yard a bit ago. Nothing but skin and bones. Soaked from sleeping in the rain, covered in fleas. Gave her some food and water. She's doing pretty alright now. Edit. Update. She hasn't come back into my yard yet, but I've seen her around the neighborhood getting food. She's doing a lot better now. D. Also, figured out that her food was just getting eaten by other neighborhood animals. Thank you for taking care of her. Had a neighbor a few houses down who kept to himself. One day he was turning onto our road and I happened to be behind him. Some kids were cutting across his yard, so he stopped to yell at them and I couldn't go around, so I was stuck. He then started backing up, but I had only a little room before backing into a very busy road. He then hit the front of my car and yelling at me. I was maybe 18 at the time and was legitimately terrified. I was able to make it down the block to my house. Called my mom and she encouraged me to make a police report. The officer came, was super kind and offered to go to the house of the man who hit me to get his insurance information. The man refused to answer and the officer made a report and called to check in later in the afternoon. That night the neighbor ended up taking a shotgun and pounded on a few neighbors' doors, presumably looking for me. The police were called and quite a few officers responded. They could not find the man, so had everyone on our street shelter in place until they could find him. Officers ended up finding him under a boat in his backyard. I don't know if he was arrested or committed, but he never was back at his house and his family sold it a few months later. Probably committed. That's some crazy behavior. My downstairs neighbor was building bombs and accidentally detonated something that was in progress and wrecked his hands. A nurse at the hospital notified police that the wounds were suspicious and they came to investigate. I was woken up to police forcibly entering his apartment. Shortly after, an officer notified us that we needed to evacuate as there was a likely M lab in the apartment. There wasn't. It was only bombs. After the polar vortex a few years ago, the mail finally came. Sub-zero temperatures froze the snow in a way that mail couldn't be delivered. I was basically in my house for a week and just so delighted about the mail seeing another person outside that I said hello to a neighbor I know better than to talk to. She immediately burst into tears and started telling me about how she found out her boyfriend ejaculated into her coffee every morning. Right around this time, her big dog burst through the front door and before she could finish saying, "He won't hurt you," the dog bit me in the stomach. Luckily didn't draw blood. I kindly excused myself and went back into my home to regret ever leaving in the first place. A true story. Bunch of C kids moved into an apartment down the hall during COVID because the landlord property manager neglected a proper background check out of desperation to lease it out. C kids continually invited their C kid friends over, and the whole place deteriorated beyond belief. Uber Eats, mailroom parcels and HelloFresh deliveries disappeared into thin air. Storage cages were broken into and 3 entire cars were stolen. The police were notified over and over again, but the issue was actually locating the main culprit in order to detain etc. She was not on the lease but one of the frequent visitors. The cherry on top was when one of the sickheads decided to take a ginormous, sloppy crap in the lobby, on the floor, right outside the elevators. I so badly wanted to believe it belonged to someone's sick dog and that they would be back downstairs any moment to clean it up, but the huge smear on the corner wall, which I later learned was where the culprit had wiped her butt, and the crap filled adult underwear flung down the other end of the corridor said otherwise. It stayed there until morning because the building manager couldn't find an available after hours cleaner. Sickheads continued to live there for at least a solid month while building management fought the landlord to evict them. The landlord was informed of all of the above and still allowed them to continue leasing the apartment because they worried they'd struggle to find anyone else to replace them since COVID lockdowns and associated financial burdens caused so many rentals to become vacant. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.